There's a photograph that almost no one talks about. It was taken at 27,000 feet on the southeast ridge of Everest. In it, a man is doubled over under a load that weighs more than his own body. He's breathing through a thin tube of supplemental oxygen. Behind him, the sky is the deep, violent blue of extreme altitude. And in the distance, tiny, almost invisible, you can make out a line of brightly dressed Western climbers, standing upright, posing for photos at the summit. The man carrying the load has no camera, no Instagram, no sponsor. He has a rope and a prayer. His name was Dorje. He had carried loads to that ridge 11 times. 11. And each time he came back down, alive. He was paid a daily rate lower than what the expedition's clients spent on a single gear upgrade. This is not a story about climbing Everest. This is a story about who really climbs it and who gets left behind. Every year, hundreds of people attempt to summit Mount Everest. They come from wealthy countries. They spend months training, tens of thousands of dollars on permits, and 6 figures total when you count guides, gear, and logistics. The media celebrates them. Documentaries follow them. When they reach the top, the world applauds. But almost nobody asks who built the ladders they crossed, who fixed the ropes they clipped into, who carried the oxygen that kept them alive, who, at 2 a.m. in a killing cold, left camp first so the clients could sleep a little longer. The Sherpa people have lived in the shadow of the Himalayas for centuries. They are arguably the finest high-altitude mountaineers in the world, not just because of training, but because of biology, acclimatization built across generations, and a relationship with this mountain that goes far deeper than conquest. And yet, for most of Everest's commercial history, they have been treated as infrastructure, tools, load bearers, expendable. That's the word that matters here. Expendable. Because what this story reveals isn't just injustice. It's a system that was designed, quietly and deliberately, to make sure nobody had to feel responsible for it. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to 1953, when Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay stood on the summit of Everest for the first time. The world saw it as a triumph of British ambition. Hillary, the New Zealand beekeeper turned explorer, became the face of the achievement. He was knighted, celebrated, written into history books in a dozen languages. Norgay, a Sherpa born in Nepal, whose knowledge of the mountain had made the whole thing possible, received a medal. He was described in some early press accounts as Hillary's native guide, a sidekick, a detail. The hierarchy was established before the world even had time to question it. Over the following decades, as Everest became a commercial enterprise, as expedition companies began selling the summit like a product, that hierarchy calcified into something worse. It became policy. Western clients paid enormous sums for the experience of climbing. And those sums trickled down through layers of operators, agencies, and logistics companies before they reached the people doing the most dangerous work. By the time the money got to the Sherpas, there wasn't much left. And nobody, not the governments, not the tourism boards, not the expedition companies, was in any particular hurry to change that. Here is a number that should stop you cold. Sherpas working on Everest are roughly 10 times more likely to die on the job than fishermen on deep-sea trawlers, which is historically considered one of the most dangerous professions on Earth. More dangerous than coal mining, more dangerous than combat in certain military operations. 10 times. And yet, for much of Everest's commercial history, the life insurance provided to Sherpas by expedition operators was worth somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000. Barely enough to cover a few months' expenses for the family left behind. Compare that to what a single Western client was paying to be there, anywhere from $30,000 to $100,000 or more. The math wasn't just unfair, it was obscene. But here's what made it sustainable. And this is the part that takes real effort to sit with. The Sherpa community needed the income. Nepal is one of the poorest countries in Asia. The wages from Everest expeditions, as low as they were, represented real money in regions with few other economic opportunities. The system had trapped people inside a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Work the mountain, risk everything, or don't, and watch your family struggle. Expedition companies knew this. Many of them counted on it. And then the ice moved. April 18th, 2014, 7:30, Phurba Ongyal Sherpa woke up at 3 a.m. that morning and ate rice. He did this before every carry. His wife had packed extra because the route to Camp 2 required multiple loads, and he might not be back until evening. He was 24 years old. He had been working Everest expeditions for 3 seasons. He was good at it, meticulous about checking his crampons, respected by the older guides, known for moving efficiently in the dark. That morning, he and a group of fellow Sherpas entered the Khumbu icefall at first light. The icefall is unlike any other section of the mountain. It is not just steep or cold or exposed. It is alive. The Khumbu Glacier moves constantly, sometimes as much as a meter per day. The ice towers, called seracs, form and collapse on no predictable schedule. Every person who enters the icefall knows, in some part of themselves they try not to think about too hard, that it could simply decide to rearrange itself at any moment. If you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe. Because trust me, this is far from the wildest story out there. This is why the carries happen before dawn. Cooler temperatures slow the movement. The ice is marginally more stable in the dark. Marginally. At approximately 6:45 in the morning, a hanging serac, a section of glacier the size of a 10-story building, suspended on the west shoulder of the mountain, broke free. The sound, survivors would later say, was not like an explosion. It was something lower, something that seemed to come from inside the mountain itself. A groan, and then nothing but the roar of thousands of tons of ice in motion. It happened in seconds, less than seconds. There was no time to run, no time to call out. The debris field swept through the section of the icefall where the Sherpa team was working and simply erased them from the surface of the mountain. 16 men were killed. Pemba Sherpa, Ash Bahadur Gurung, Lakpa Tenjing Sherpa, Cheering Ongchu Sherpa. These are not abstractions. These are people who had names their mothers gave them. People who had eaten breakfast that morning. People who had left notes or hadn't because they expected to be home by evening. The youngest was 18 years old. He had been on his first expedition. At base camp, the news arrived in fragments. Radio calls, shouting. The peculiar, terrible silence that falls over a place after a catastrophic sound. Western climbers emerged from their tents. Some immediately moved to help with rescue efforts. Others stood and watched. A few, accounts suggest, asked expedition leaders whether the route would still be operational, whether the season could be salvaged. It is not comfortable to say that out loud. But it happened. And it matters, because it tells you something about the lens through which many of the people in that place had been trained to see the mountain, and the people who served them on it. Rescue teams worked for hours. They recovered bodies from the debris field. They dug through ice with their hands. They performed the brutal, intimate labor of finding the men they had worked alongside and carrying them down. This work, too, was done largely by Sherpas. In the days that followed, The Sherpa community did something the industry had not seen before at this scale, and had not prepared for. They gathered, they talked, and then they announced that they would not continue the season. This was not a spontaneous act of rage. It was considered deliberate and costly because many of those men needed the income from a full expedition season. Walking off the mountain in mid-April meant losing weeks of wages their families depended on. They did it anyway. And the demands they made were not radical. They asked for better death compensation for families, for more comprehensive insurance, for formal representation in decisions that affected their safety, for the Nepali government to establish a proper relief fund, for the people making money from Everest to acknowledge, formally and materially, that Sherpa lives were not an acceptable line item in a risk calculation. The climbing world reacted with a mixture of sympathy, frustration, and, in some corners, barely concealed contempt. There were climbers who called the walkout an overreaction. Commentators who noted, with studied reasonableness, that the Sherpas understood the risks when they signed on, as if understanding a risk makes it acceptable to absorb it on someone else's behalf, for a fraction of what they're paying. The 2014 season was abandoned. The summit of Everest that year went unclimbed. And somewhere in Nepal, 16 families sat with the weight of what the mountain had taken from them, while the industry that had profited from their fathers and brothers and sons began the quiet work of figuring out how to open for business again in the following spring. What followed the 2014 disaster was revealing. Not because of what changed, but because of how hard the industry worked to make sure as little as possible did. Nepal's government announced increased compensation for Sherpa families. The numbers went up from a few $1,000s to around $11,000 per death. Expedition companies pledged improvements to working conditions. International mountaineering organizations released reports. There were summits and meetings and documents. But the fundamental structure remained untouched. The route was still the Khumbu icefall. The work of load carrying and rope fixing still fell overwhelmingly to Sherpas. The income gap between Sherpa workers and Western clients stayed vast. And the implicit logic of the commercial model, that Sherpa risk was a cost to be managed, not a crisis to be confronted, persisted, quiet and unspoken, beneath every improvement. There's a psychological term for this: moral licensing. The idea that doing something good, raising compensation, issuing statements, attending summits, gives people permission to stop thinking harder about the problem. The expedition industry licensed itself, said the right things, and moved on. Then, in 2015, the mountain struck again. The Raster earthquake that hit Nepal on April 25th of that year triggered an avalanche that swept through Everest Base Camp. 19 people died. Hundreds more were stranded. And once again, the burden of rescue, of carrying the injured, of holding the system together under catastrophic conditions, fell largely to Sherpa workers. By this point, the pattern was impossible to ignore, if you were paying attention. There's something that rarely makes it into the documentaries and the magazine profiles. Something that isn't captured by casualty statistics or wage comparisons. It's what the exploitation does to a culture, to a people, to an identity. The Sherpa relationship with the Himalayas is ancient and sacred. These mountains are not obstacles to be conquered. They are the physical presence of deities. Chomolungma, the name for Everest in Tibetan, means something closer to Goddess Mother of the world. For centuries, Sherpas approached the high peaks with reverence, with ceremony, with an understanding that the mountain demanded respect. Commercial expeditions brought a different philosophy: conquest, achievement, a checkmark on a bucket list. And in repackaging Everest as a product, as something you could buy your way to the top of, the industry also, quietly, repackaged the Sherpas as part of that product, part of the service, the authentic local element that made the experience feel real. Sherpa names appeared in expedition brochures not as people, but as features. Expert local guides, indigenous knowledge. The implication was warmth, tradition, color, not personhood. And because the economic structures made resistance so costly, generation after generation continue the work. Fathers brought sons. Sons became the best at what they did. And the excellence was exploited as evidence that everything was fine. Look how skilled they are. Look how they love this mountain. Loving something and being allowed to be destroyed by it are not the same thing. That distinction was never really made clearly enough by the people profiting from the arrangement. In the years following 2014 and 2015, something did begin to shift. But not from the top down. Not from governments or expedition companies or mountaineering federations. It shifted because Sherpas started telling their own stories. Books were written, films were made, testimonies given at international forums. And for the first time, the narrative wasn't about what Western climbers felt standing on the summit. It was about what Sherpas felt carrying them there. And what they described was not uniform. Things they were. That is the truth that sits at the center of the Everest industry. Not a villain, not a single bad decision, but a system built carefully, maintained quietly, that made exploitation the default. Everest still opens every year. The permits are still sold. The clients still arrive at base camp, wide-eyed and full of ambition. And Sherpas still go up first, in the dark, in the cold, to make the dream possible for someone who will receive all the glory for it. Some things have improved. Wages have risen in some expeditions. Insurance terms have been updated. A few companies have built reputations on treating their Sherpa staff with genuine equity. There is more awareness now than there was 10 years ago. But awareness is not justice. And improvement is not transformation. The mountain has not changed. It is still the highest place on earth. It is still lethal, still indifferent, still capable of killing in seconds without notice or apology. No amount of money changes that. What can change is who we choose to see when we look at a summit photograph. Whether we see one person's achievement or the invisible architecture of courage, sacrifice, and expertise that made it possible. There's a tradition among Sherpa climbers. Before every major climb, they hold a puja, a ceremony to ask the mountain's permission, to acknowledge that they are entering something larger than themselves, to accept that the mountain is in charge, not them. Perhaps that's what the rest of us need to accept too, that the mountain belongs to no one. And the people who know it best deserve more than to be left carrying everyone else's ambitions in silence. If you want more videos like this, make sure to subscribe.